Hi, my name's Ed Hill, and this is the YouTube channel dedicated to the podcast A Grand Tour with My Great-Great-Grandad, which basically revolves around the journals written by my great-great-grandfather William Mowbray Scott in the 1840s about his time as an engineer, firstly working on railways in Italy and then in the Mint in Mexico. So this video is part 2 of an interview that I did with the railway historian Anthony Dawson about the development of the early railways, because that's the sort of time frame in which William was doing his train driving. And at the end of the last video we finished discussing how at that time quite often engine drivers from Britain would accompany the steam engines that were being exported to various countries to their destination to help set up the railway. So that was the sort of thing that William was doing when he goes to Italy in 1840. And in this next section of the video, I begin by asking Anthony really about how the public sort of took a while to get used to train sort of locomotion and steam travel, because it was sort of so much faster than had been previously the case with things like stagecoaches, etc. So this is really, we cover how it took some time for the public to adjust to these new speeds, and then we go on to discuss some of the effects that the railways had more generally, if you like, in the sort of development of countries and society around Europe at that time. So I hope you enjoy it. Now, there's a couple of incidents in the railway. This next question was about basically, the sort of dangers of railway travel early on in their existence, and not only are there quite sort of dangerous accidents happening with the technology itself, like with boilers exploding and things like that, but also just people getting too close to trains on the track, being hit by them and stuff like this. But it doesn't seem to deter people coming across my research, just because he goes on a train from Paris to Versailles. About a year later, there's a terrible accident and about 200 people get killed and stuff like that. But it just strikes me that, because I don't know what you think people's attitude to it was, but they were still willing to go on these trains despite, it seems to me, quite high rates of accidents that happened early on with the technology.
It was because, rather like now, the railway was convenient.
Yeah.
It emerged in 1830 as a sort of a novelty. If you look at something like the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, within the first 3 months, it had become an established part of doing things because it was convenient, it was fast, it was cheap, it was relatively reliable. With the problems for the Liverpool and Manchester was that the travelling public took a long time to adapt to it.
Yes.
Because they were still used to doing things at stagecoach speed.
Yeah.
That's not to say stagecoaches were safe, because they weren't, especially if the horses ran away or if they were overloaded or a wheel broke.
Yeah.
But on the Liverpool and Manchester, you still see people trying to alight from a moving train because they weren't judging the speed, they weren't judging the distance, or people getting off to collect their hat.
Yes.
The big problem they did have was the issue of brakes and stopping these things. Because the locomotives didn't have brakes on them. The way you slowed down a locomotive like Planet or Peyton T was to put it in reverse and to put steam through the steam circuit the other way around, to use back pressure in the cylinders to stop it. Not a case of wheels spinning around like Casey Jones, but a very gentle coming to a stop using that. It takes a lot of skill to do it, and it's a lot of fun to do it.
Yeah,
that's how it was braked. The tender brakes were a handbrake, and the carriages would have had a handbrake manned by a guard, But on many railways, you had two guards, one at the front, one at the back. So if a train of 5 or 6 carriages, there's only 2 braked vehicles on it. That's not really going to stop it. And the accident on the Paris-Versailles railway at Meudon in 1842, that was due to the train being overloaded, completely overloaded. It was full to capacity by the time it left. The accident was caused by the breakage of a locomotive axle at the front, a locomotive called Mathieu Murray. It had been built in Leeds. The axle broke and the engine behind it piled over, and you ended up with a pile of carriages and people meters high.
Yeah.
But what made it worse was because the passengers were locked into the carriages. But that was understandable in context because a couple of weeks before, someone had tried to commit suicide by jumping out of a carriage.
Right.
So the railway took the decision to, no, we will lock the carriage doors to prevent this happening. Then you have the accident at Meudon, where people were burned alive and it was hard to identify the bodies because there's nothing left other than their teeth. The law was then changed that said, no, carriages aren't going to have their doors locked because people will die.
Yeah. Because it was the fire, wasn't it? That really.
It was the fire.
Yeah. That
it was rather like Quintus Hill in 1916, nearly a century earlier. But it did lead to an understanding in safety and metal fatigue.
Yes. It's interesting because, Williams. I wondered about this because Williams travelling in at about 1840, about 2 years before, and I wondered whether the carriages were locked. But probably when he got in it, they weren't.
They probably weren't. No.
So, and as you said, that interesting thing it was really the first example where they began to look at the concept of metal fatigue, wasn't it? Because of the axle breaking. But given the few incidents that happened on Williams Railway, I think it is very much that thing that you referred to there, that people just weren't used to things going this fast. No. And so they just misjudged distances and stuff, quite often. And then that seems to me, with the particular accidents that happened on Williams Railway, the real cause of the problem. Fortunately, they don't have any sort of technical problems or explosions or anything like that, but it's just people not being able to judge just how quick, because I think I don't know, stagecoach maximum is about 8 miles an hour, maybe?
8 miles an hour, yeah.
Yeah. So, and what sort of speeds would these trains have been able to manage at that time?
20 to 25.
Right, yeah.
But we know, like, Robert Stephenson's Planet in 1830 went from Liverpool to Manchester in under an hour.
Yeah.
So she's making at least 30 miles an hour.
Yeah. William talks about going from Milan to Monza, which is only 8 miles, but he talks about, I think on average the journey was done in 20 minutes, but he does say at one point, I've done it in 11.
With the brace of that period, no thank you.
So maybe hopefully there weren't many passengers on that day, or it was the last train back or something. I don't know. No one was risking on it, and he thought he'd really open it up. I don't know, but just to mention, as we touched on earlier on about wrought iron rails and things like that, in the example of Williams Railway, it looks like they didn't actually use sleepers. They used sort of almost like stone blocks to put the railways, and then every, I don't know, few yards there was a kind of steel cross member that was kind of meant to keep the gauge in line. Seems a bit of an overcomplicated way of doing it to me, but I just thought, have you heard of any other examples where that may have been the case, and was there? Because the railway sleeper seems a pretty dependable sort of technology to me to have diverted from,
The wooden railway sleeper is quite a late addition.
Oh, is it?
So, from about 1770, railways were laid with, where they were iron, were laid in stone blocks.
Oh, right, okay.
Just 2 rows of stone blocks with ballast packed around them.
Yeah. For
the simple reason that you had to keep the space between the rails clear for a horse to walk. So if you're using transverse sleepers, the horse will be constantly falling over it.
Ah, right. Yes, I see. I understand.
But
Yes.
the problem with this is, and again, this is from having excavated 2 sites this year, is that the ballast is taking up over the top of these blocks to try and stop them spreading laterally. But there's really nothing to stop it from spreading wide to gauge.
Yeah, yeah.
So, say, Stockton and Darlington was on these stone blocks. Liverpool and Manchester was on stone blocks.
Was it?
And they're constantly having problem with the track, particularly in curves where it was spreading, because there's nothing to retain it.
Yeah.
And your mention of tyre bars on the Leeds and Selby Railway, which was the first mainline railway in Yorkshire, which opened in September 1834, that had wrought iron tyre bars between the sleepers to keep it to gauge.
Yeah, yeah.
The Liverpool and Manchester did use wooden sleepers, but they were only temporary because they used them on the embankments where it was thought the weight of the stones would sink.
Yeah.
And famously, they used wooden sleepers on Chat Moss going over a bog.
Yes, yeah.
Where the stone sleepers would very rapidly disappear on the bog.
Yeah.
Because the belief was that the railway structure had to be as solid as possible.
Yeah, yeah. It's very interesting that, because to me, in my mind, the railway sleeper seems such a simple but great solution to that, the problems. But then, of course, there's these legacies of having to deal with horses and things like that, of course. So
they hadn't realised that the railway's dynamic and it needs to be elastic.
Yeah,
George Stephenson hadn't. Brunel hadn't. The first chap to recognise it was, again, Liverpool and Manchester, called Edward Woods, who went, hang on a minute, we've got this all the wrong way around, guys. The area of our track with the least amount of rail breakage or wheel breakage is Chat Moss.
Yeah.
Why is this? Oh, it's because it's springy.
Yeah, yeah.
The highest proportion of rail and wheel breakages was on Olive Mount cutting, which is a stone cutting, where the rails and chairs were just literally laid on the stone floor of the cutting.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because the thought was it has to be absolutely rock solid.
Yes.
It's not going to work. It's going to break your wheels, break your rail. So he was the first one to recognise it. And from then on, you very slowly get this adoption of wooden sleepers as standard. But it takes years to catch on.
That's very, very interesting. Just, my logic would have kind of thought the other way around almost, that you'd start with the basic thing of the sleeper and, I almost imagine they were almost, the Italian railway engineers were almost over-engineering what they were trying to do in the case of Williams Railway.
What was done in British was perfectly standard.
Yeah. Just touching on this thing, the railway had these towers about, I'm not quite sure what intermittent they were. I suspect maybe a mile, 2 miles. I imagine it's how far someone could see, down the track with a flag and wave it. But you say that's quite an unusual. You hadn't sort of come across that that example of that before. To me, it seems a bit over the top, because when I look at the track, it's pretty well straight all the way from Milan to Monza. There's not much deviation. But perhaps they were just safety concerns. That might have been the case.
It would probably be an improvement in what they're doing on Britain. And Liverpool and Manchester, for the signalling, you had a constable with a set of flags every mile.
Right, yeah.
And whether they were in visual communication, no idea.
Right, yeah. So elevating on them on a tower at least would have been an improvement on that. Which
it would help with sighting, and you get a better view of it.
Yes, yeah.
And this is because, of course, before semaphore signalling came along.
Yeah.
So they're still basically dealing with little men with flags every mile or so.
Yeah.
Trying to communicate with each other. And the problem is, of course, there's no one be able to communicate with a train.
Yeah.
Because these were worked usually on a time interval system.
Yeah.
Where it was important that a train would be set off every 20 minutes or so. And they would continue to set off trains every 20 minutes or so, because as far as they were aware, it was safe. The default signalling at that period was all clear. Now it's danger.
Yes.
And no one was to know something had gone wrong until someone came running up saying there's been a terrible smash around the next curve.
Yeah.
And you're still dispatching trains into this thing.
Yeah. Because when I first read about Williams Railway being the second railway in Italy as opposed to the first one, which I think you have done a video on the first one, which I've seen. Is it Naples to Porcini or yeah. I a bit unfairly sort of said that was a bit of a vanity project for the Duke or whatever it was, so he could go from his palace to the beach. I think I think I'm being a bit unfair there, but that it was actually a bit more of a genuine transport solution. I think that first railway, wasn't it? Than I.
Yeah.
But it does strike me that. Italy was a little bit behind the curve of other European nations in developing their railways, but certainly from the passenger figures that William talks about, it very quickly proved, how efficient it was in moving people. And I think there really, as in the UK, there was this railway explosion or railway mania, as it sometimes terms, isn't it? I imagine that was happening all over Europe, as we've kind of touched on, really.
Yeah, there was this mania. There was this everyone trying to keep up with each other, this very rapid adoption of the railway, because not only was it convenient, but it was good business. You could put money in it, and they were profitable. You got money out at the other end in dividend payments as shareholders. And a lot of European railways were in fact funded by financiers from Britain.
Right.
So you have a very strong group of financiers from Liverpool, called the Liverpool Party, who are mostly Quakers and other nonconformists. They bankroll Liverpool and Manchester and other railways in the north, but then they also spread their wings, so to speak, and they start financing railways across Europe. But much of their wealth to invest in railways in the 1830s is largely due to the slavery compensation payments, which funds that first wave in the 1830s. And by the 1840s, this whole thing has just snowballed as a means to get rich quick.
Yeah. So they're moving their money away from slavery and into the railways, I suppose.
Yeah, because it's instant money.
Yeah.
And where you end up with, not just in Britain but across Europe, where you have railway companies started which exist only on paper, where you have people owning shares in a company that doesn't actually exist, who think they're going to become amazingly rich, but when the whole bubble crashes 1846 to 1848, the whole lot comes crashing down, because it was like the dot-com boom. There was nothing really behind it.
Yeah.
It had inflated too quickly.
Yeah.
And the only way was down from that point, where the whole lot just imploded.
Yeah. It's funny, you literally beat me to the point there that that comparison with the dot-com thing is very much also in the beginning of the technology and how it was transformative, but also then, as you say, in the collapse of it. It is a very good comparison to make, really, isn't it? Very, very suitable one. We're not much further to go now, but I was just going to say, in terms of after 1840 and the development of the railways, William's very much at this time when it's transitioning. He travels by stagecoach down from London to Dover, and when he gets to Dover, he's talking about how they're actually cutting the tunnel from Folkestone, I think it is, to Dover, and he makes a reference to William Cubitt's involvement in the railway and says, this will stand for all time as a glorious mark of engineering, or kind of a monument to engineering is sort of the kind of term that he uses. That whole transformative effect, because he talks about the gruff coachman telling him to get on and off the coach, the stagecoach, when they stop at Chatham on the way down and stuff like this. He says in the next 2 years, because he's writing this a little bit later, about 4 years later, that has all been transformed. So again, it shows how rapidly this was, but in those 2 years, the railway from London to Dover had been built. And like you say, that's how everyone would now travel. They would...
Yeah. And one of the major impetuses for that change in Britain to the southern channel ports and across Europe was also defence. Because in Britain, it meant you could get soldiers quicker down to the channel ports in case of invasion.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Portsmouth or Southampton. But it also meant you could get your soldiers around the country quicker for internal defence as well. Because there was no police, and soldiers were used on policing duties. And the same was true in Europe, where in Britain the network just basically grew thanks to laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah, yeah.
Across Europe, there was much more regulation, and the governments had a much more involved role with the railways, because they would identify strategic routes. They would offer a tender to a private company to build and operate the thing, which is one reason why there's less route mileage. Because the routes are more strategic, there's no duplication. And because you have this sense of they're doing more than moving people. These are economic routes, but they're also military routes. So you have this hub of railways being built out of Paris, heading again towards the French Channel ports, but also heading out east towards the Belgian frontier. And then down to Lyon, Marseille, joining up France. And the same thing, Belgium, building railways to its ports and its frontiers, and same in Germany. So it's all about moving goods and people, but it's also they're looking at it with an eye of moving soldiers. And literally within 25 years of the Liverpool and Manchester railway opening, you've got a railway being built actually in a war zone during the Crimean War.
Yeah.
That's a quarter of a century going from the first public railway to the railway being a war-winning weapon.
Yes.
Massive development.
Yes.
It's like the Wright brothers aeroplane in 1903 to the First World War.
That's a very interesting point that I hadn't really appreciated, is that whole strategic kind of military side of it that, as you say, in Europe, from what you're telling me, was also a big motivation for building the railways, and I suppose there is this massive overhang of the Napoleonic Wars and everything, isn't it? You've talked on it economically, but it's just it's very pervasive. Even I still, in much of what William's referring to, that whole thing overhangs. Even in those years, it still overhangs. And in a way, it's not surprising, because it's only a few years. It's not that long, 1815, when Napoleon's finally defeated. We're only talking 15 years.
Lifetimes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it's also a means of creating a country, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Because it suddenly means the centre of the government is in more control of the periphery. Napoleon III said that the railways were a veritable army of peace, and he saw them as a means of nation building. You're bringing a country together. You suddenly start to have, say, in Britain or France, you have the same time zones introduced. You no longer have local time. You have London or you have Paris time. Again, using a French example, you're going from having Parisian French as the language of the state and lots of regional patois to suddenly you have a greater means of extending French, Parisian French across the country. Same with Germany, bringing together what was a patchwork of countries into a single country. And again, with Italy.
Yes.
A complete patchwork, but you're suddenly starting to see these railways joining up.
Yes.
This little patchwork of countries.
Yes.
Particularly in the 1830s, when you have this renewed nationalism on the back of the French Revolution of 1830. You have the Belgian Revolution 1830. You suddenly have Belgium coming into existence. You have the Carbonari in Italy, and you have the first flowering of the Italian republics and its movements towards a unified Italy in the 1830s. You have it then in 1848.
Yes.
The railway is creating a sense of nationhood.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, actually, which I hadn't really thought of. But yes, it's this means of communication, isn't it? It's bringing everybody, both both politically and as sort of societies closer together. And it is now I think about it, that whole thing of German unification and Italian unification happening along those same timelines as the railways are developing is very noticeable, isn't it? I hadn't really kind of made that association before, but of course it's
the same with the idea of railways making America. So what they did is the only way you could communicate between the East and West Coast is by railway. You have the railway in the 19th century is a mechanism for making nations.
Well, I've pretty well covered most things I wanted to talk about, Anthony, but just out of interest, I noticed that on one of your videos you talk about a railway exported to Mexico, and that's actually after he spends his 2 years in Milan. That's where William ends up going to work in the mint out in Mexico. But at that time, I think the railway, the engine you're talking about, is about the same time. But I think the development of railways in Mexico was much slower. Even the technology he's talking about in terms of the mint and making coins and stuff is still very much horse and cart kind of era rather than steam era, and that's obviously why he's there, to try and bring more mechanization into it. I think perhaps railways in South America took a bit longer to develop than certainly in the north of America, Northern America.
Lack of money.
Yeah.
And being largely a rural agrarian society.
Yeah.
There's no major centres to join up, as it were.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for your time, and it's been a very interesting discussion, and really you wrote, as I say, several points that I hadn't kind of thought of before, and associations about things in the development. And it is a fascinating time. As I say, I fairly early on just made this comparison with the IT, or whatever you want to call it, internet kind of revolution of what we've lived through. But this was a very similar, if not even more impactful development of technology, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Well, once again, thanks for your time. So that's the end of the interview. I hope you enjoyed it and found it instructive. I'd just like to thank Anthony once again for agreeing to do the interview. It certainly helped me a lot in my research doing the podcast and learning these additional things about early railway history that I didn't really know about. So it's been very informative and helpful from that point of view. If you want to learn more about early railways and steam trains, you can actually tune into Anthony's own YouTube channel, which is called Rail Story, and that's at Anthony Dawson History. And there are lots of videos there, particularly about the very early steam trains, so very much about this period in which they were being manufactured and exported around the world. And lastly, if you've enjoyed this video, do tune in to the podcast Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. It's available on all the usual podcast platforms, and if you Google that whole title, I'm sure it will come up, and you can see it there and listen to it on whatever platform you've got. And I hope you like it, and subscribe. As I say, it's a very interesting and I think unique account of this period of history from someone who is very much involved in the industry side of things, but also who was really taking the opportunity to take in the cultural sights and sounds that he was seeing at the time as well. So it really is a fascinating and unique account from someone who just happens to be my great-great-grandfather as well. But so do tune into that. And lastly, once again, thanks for watching.